Think of a station wagon or an estate, whatever you want to call it, as the original crossover vehicle. The formula for creating one is fairly simple. They take a sedan, in this case the Volvo S90, and then they add a bigger box to the back, creating the V90 and the V90 Cross Country. That creates a vehicle with many of the practicalities of the average crossover, but rides and drives more like the average sedan. And in the process, it will give you almost double the cargo capacity in the back. At this point, I should disclose that I have owned two Volvos in the past, and one of them was a Volvo Wagon. It was a 2006 Volvo V90R. Because the V90 and V90 Cross Country are essentially S90 wagons, the vast majority of what you see in this vehicle is identical to the S90 sedan, except of course for that larger cargo area in the back. That means that we have this very large and distinctive Volvo grille up front, 360-degree camera integrated right there into that Volvo logo, and we have the Thor's Hammer full LED headlamps. The model we're driving is the V90 Cross Country, so the front end is a little bit different than the non-cross country version of the V90. The V90 Cross Country is basically a regular V90 that's had its ride height increased. They've tweaked the front bumper just a little bit to make it look a little bit more rugged, and then they make all-wheel drive standard. A lot of people were expecting the non-cross-country version of the V90 to disappear from America because wagons aren't exactly popular in this country. Wagon lovers will be glad to hear that that didn't happen. Instead, Volvo decided to make the V90 an order-only option. So if you want a V90 cross-country, you can find one of these hanging out on dealer lots. You can buy it today and drive it away today. If you want a V90 wagon without the cross-country bits, then you have to order that or do overseas delivery, but you can still buy it in the United States. There was a time in America where you could find a station wagon version of just about every family sedan or luxury sedan, but those times are gone. And now the Volvo V90 wagon really is in a very lonely category because the only other station wagon in this particular price range and size range is the Mercedes-Benz E-Class wagon. Because we no longer have a 5 Series wagon in the US and we no longer have an A6 wagon in the US. Jaguar and Cadillac have flirted with wagons in the past, and we may see a Jaguar XF wagon in the US at some point. That would be about the same size as the V90 wagon. Audi does sell the A4 wagon and the A4 Allroad, however, it is notably smaller than this. It's about 6 inches shorter overall. At the moment, the V90 wagon is also almost exactly the same size as the Volvo S90 sedan. Quite logical because, again, this is an S90 wagon. That's changing a little bit for 2018, of course, because the United States for 2018 will only be getting the new long wheelbase S90. When you take a closer look at the front of the V90 wagon, you'll notice something that differentiates this from that Buick Regal wagon that we saw introduced not that long ago. This car has a more rear-wheel drive proportion than we find in that Buick Regal. The distance between this tire and the front door is very BMW or Mercedes-like, and the overhang that we find, which is the distance from the very front of the bumper to that front of the tire, is relatively short, even when we compare this to something like an Audi A4. That's because Volvo's latest generation of vehicles has been designed only to accommodate 4-cylinder engines under the hood. The side profile of the V90 and the V90 Cross Country have upset some of the Volvo faithful because this is not as square as Volvo wagons of the past. Volvo decided to style this vehicle more like the modern shooting brake than the traditional Volvo wagon with the very, very flat back. The overall shape is modern and attractive, and I'm told more aerodynamic than a very flat back end. However, it is less practical because we get much less cargo room in the back than if this roofline had come all the way back and then simply dropped to the ground. Out back, we see a combination of S90 design cues and XC90 design cues, and overall the V90 looks fairly wide, and that's because it is. Again, this is a mid-size luxury sedan class vehicle, Mercedes-Benz E-Class, Audi A6, BMW 5 Series, not an S60 sized vehicle. Again, because we're in the cross-country trim, we have cross-country embossed right there in this black section of the rear bumper, and the rear bumper itself is slightly different for this particular trim. Volvo has been on a mission lately to drastically improve fuel economy and emissions, and part of that strategy is an all 4-cylinder lineup, so you will not find any 6-cylinder or 8-cylinder engines under this hood. Things start out with a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine in the V90 T5 model that produces 250 horsepower. The V90 T6 and all versions of the V90 Cross Country get the T6 version of the engine, which is what we're taking a look at right here. That builds on that same 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine by adding a supercharger. So this has a supercharger and a turbocharger. The supercharger operates at lower RPMs, giving this instant torque off the line. The turbocharger works at higher RPMs, helping this engine keep from running out of steam like some supercharged engines can. Both engines are mated to a standard 8-speed automatic transmission, and if you get the T6 version of the engine, then all-wheel drive becomes standard. Volvo has yet to say whether their T8 hybrid drivetrain will make it into the V90 in America, but it is offered in Europe, so I would expect to find it under this hood at some time. The T8 hybrid system builds on the T6 by keeping the turbocharger and the supercharger and then adding an all-wheel drive hybrid system to it. We get an electric motor in the back and an auxiliary electric motor up front, bringing the total horsepower figure to over 400. I suspect most shoppers in America will be selecting this T6 drivetrain, and if you do, you'll get 25 miles per gallon combined. You can thank Volvo's all-new 4-cylinder engine family for the rear-wheel drive look of the S90 and the V90. You'll notice that the bulk of the engine is actually sitting right here. What's going on here is a lot of engine cover and other pretty bits, but the bulk of the engine is actually sitting right here, just about 2 inches in front of the front axle. That's quite different than what we see going on in modern Audi models or Volvos of the past, where the engine was more in front of the front axle than it is now. That obviously helps improve the weight balance of the S90 and the V90, but it also meant that the front end didn't have to be designed quite as long, because if you aren't designing this vehicle to accommodate a much wider V6 or V8 or even an inline-6 engine, then you don't have to make the nose quite so long. They can actually shrink the distance between the very front of the vehicle and the front axle a little bit to help improve the overall aesthetics. You'll notice that while we were looking at the front of the V90, I did not comment on this vehicle's radar sensor. That's because you won't find it on the front grille. You'll actually find it right here behind the windscreen. This is quite an interesting innovation for active safety systems. Volvo has reduced the size and complexity and integrated all of their active safety systems into this one module. Aside from the blind spot radar sensors, which you'll find located in the rear of the vehicle, all the other safety systems are using the information provided by this one module. It provides us with lane departure warning and lane keeping assistance, radar adaptive cruise control, Volvo's city safety system, which is an autonomous braking system that will detect pedestrians, cyclists, and large animals in addition to other cars, and it's the basis for Volvo's pilot assist system, which is their semi-autonomous driving system. Part of the reason that Volvo has integrated everything into one module is in order to reduce production costs. But the other reason is to help reduce operating costs for you, the owner. Because if you're involved in a minor fender bender in a vehicle with the radar sensor up front, it could get damaged and then it would need to get replaced in addition to your bumper cover, etc. But if you get in a minor fender bender in this vehicle, the radar cruise control sensor is several feet away. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give these seats 8 out of 10 points. We are in the base seat design for the V90. The up-level seat design adds things like the extending thigh cushion as well as inflatable side bolsters that really does improve the score of that seat. I'm going to give that particular model 10 out of 10 points. I do find these seats a little bit less comfortable than what we find in the Mercedes-Benz E-Class wagon. We do have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, however, and that makes it very easy for larger or taller drivers to find an ideal driving position. Another thing you'll notice in the V90 is that the front seat track is quite long. It moves a decent way back in order to give those taller drivers a good driving position. You'll find a 2-position seat memory over here on the driver's door, and then there are 3 selectable driver profiles that affect those presets as well within the Sensus infotainment system. Moving to the back seat, I'm going to give this 10 out of 10 points. I think these seats are just about as comfortable as the ones that we find in that Mercedes-Benz E-Class. I have an extraordinary amount of legroom. Sitting right here behind myself at 6 feet tall, I have about 6 inches left. And keep in mind, this is not the extended wheelbase version of the 90 series platform. We will see that in the 2018 S90. If I move all the way over to the right side of the car, this front seat is all the way back in its tracks, which is much further than you'll find in many vehicles out there, and I still have about 1 inch of legroom left. As we've seen with other Volvo wagons, the V90 and V90 Cross Country can be had with Volvo's optional integrated child booster seat that folds right there into the bottom cushion. Behind the rear hatch, we find more cargo room than you'll find in the S90 sedan at just under 20 cubic feet. However, this is notably below Volvo's last generation wagon in the US, the V70 wagon, which would hold 33. Although the cargo area is smaller than you may have expected, it is full of practical touches, like this flip-up cargo divider, which features grocery bag holders right here, and these removable straps that you can use to strap cargo into place. You can use them either on that cargo divider in the vertical position, or you can actually use them right here with these other clips in the floor to strap cargo to the bottom. If we fold that forward, you'll notice that a 22-inch roller bag, which is the largest size we can carry on a domestic flight, actually fits entirely behind that cargo divider. If you put that bag on its side, it'll still fit back here, but it won't fit behind the cargo divider. There's some additional bag holders on the side of the cargo area, a 12-volt power outlet, and then buttons to power fold the second row seats. Under the load floor, we find a small amount of additional storage. It also has a hydraulic strut there to help keep that in the open position. And then if we pull up this additional storage load floor, we find the compact spare tire. As we take a look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in sort of a mid-level trim of the V90 Cross Country, so things may be a little bit different depending on the version that you're looking at. We have the large panoramic moonroof that extends right back there to over the rear passengers' heads. The front seats feature fixed headrests. These are not adjustable at all, but we do have height adjustable seat belts. The seats feature leather upholstery, but because we're not in the top end trim, we don't have perforated leather, ventilated seats, or again the extending thigh cushion or inflatable side bolsters. As you'd expect out of a vehicle in this category, the front doors are composed entirely of soft touch plastics, then we have generous amounts of real wood trim on the doors. Because of the trim level that we're driving this week, we do not have the stitched leather doors or stitched leather dash panels, but we do find more of that real wood trim as we move on over to the dashboard itself. The overall dashboard design is essentially the same as the S90 and very similar to the Volvo XC90. The model that we're driving has the optional Bowers & Wilkins sound system, so we have that very distinctive center channel speaker right at the top of the dashboard. And all models come standard with this touchscreen Sensus infotainment and navigation system nestled into the dashboard. If you want to know more about how this system operates, there is a video on my channel that goes into great detail about this system specifically. The Sensus system is where you control most of the vehicle's functions, from climate control to your audio system, Apple CarPlay integration, phone integration, the navigation system that is built into the vehicle. We also have the ability to change vehicle settings right here as well. You'll find the others vehicle systems by swapping left or right. If we swipe to the right, we find the camera, autonomous parking system, button to fold the rear headrests, adjust the heads-up display, etc. If we go to the other side, this is where you'll find integrated vehicle apps like Pandora, the Parking Finder, Glimpse, Wiki Location, Spotify, etc. Below the touchscreen, we have a home button, and then some of the only other physical buttons in the vehicle for hazard lights, defroster, defogger, track forward, backward, a volume knob, and a play pause button. And then we have a fairly traditional console shifter. Drive is all the way to the back, manual mode is over to the left. We push away from the driver for gear up, pull towards the driver for gear down. Then we have some storage cubbies in the center console, a small one right up front where we can put our Volvo key, for instance, and then a slider where we find two large cup holders and then more of a square juice box holder. To the left of that, we have the engine start-stop toggle. We toggle clockwise for start, counterclockwise for stop, a drive mode selector knob and button. This allows us to choose between eco, comfort, off-road, dynamic, and individual that adjusts the way the suspension, the engine, and transmission behave. We have an electric parking brake and auto brake hold. Between the front seats, we have a small padded leather armrest. This opens to reveal a small storage compartment where we find two USB inputs, an auxiliary input, and just about enough room to fit some of the larger smartphones. On the driver's side, we find a large LCD instrument cluster with a digital speedometer on the left and a digital tachometer on the right. In the center, we currently have a moving map display, but that can be changed to a media display or it can be turned off entirely. The look of the system changes a little bit depending on the drive mode that we're in. So now we move to the eco mode, so instead of a tachometer, we have an eco gauge on the right. This display is not as user configurable or user adjustable as the displays that we find in modern Cadillac vehicles. This reminds me a little bit more of BMW and Jaguar models. There is a pop-up trip computer that's controlled by a button on the steering column that gives us access to things like our fuel economy, etc. We can also change our media device. There's a phone interface. If you had a Bluetooth phone paired, it would be available. It's not available if you have your phone connected via CarPlay, and you can choose recent navigation destinations. If you did select one, then we would start seeing directions right here in the center screen. The steering wheel is essentially the same three-spoke wheel that we find in a variety of other modern Volvo models. You find the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system over here on the left. This is also how you activate the pilot assist system. You toggle left to right to switch between the adaptive cruise control system and the semi-autonomous pilot assist system. Gauge the system with this little button right here in the center, speed up, speed down, distance increase, and distance decrease. On the right side of the steering wheel, we find a button that controls track forward and backward and is used for that little pop-up menu there in the instrument cluster. We press this button and then this becomes left, right, up, down, and select. In our 0 to 60 acceleration tests, the V90 Cross Country proved to be almost as brisk as the S90 sedan. We ran from 0 to 60 in 5.6 seconds. This is the 316 horsepower version, of course. That puts the V90 just a little bit behind the new E400 wagon from Mercedes. That will do 0 to 60 in about 5.1 to 5.2 seconds. Although we get a relatively similar amount of power out of this engine and that 3-liter twin-turbo engine in the Mercedes engine does produce more torque. It produces that torque at lower RPMs, and Mercedes is using a 9-speed automatic with a deeper first gear. In our braking test score, we ran from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 118 feet. That is longer than the S90 we recently tested, which did it in 109. The reason for that is that we have narrower tires on this vehicle, it's higher off the ground, and of course it is heavier. The model we're driving right here weighs about 4,200 pounds, which is a little bit lighter than the E400, but definitely heavier than the A4 Allroad. In terms of overall handling, this does come in just one notch below the A4 Allroad because of the overall size and the overall weight. The model that we're driving does have 235 width tires, which are narrower than the tires we found on the S90 sedan last time we tested it. So this is not going to handle as well as those top-end trims of the S90. But versus a comparably equipped S90 sedan, the difference is going to be somewhat minor. The biggest difference you'll notice is when you really start throwing this into corners, the softer suspension that we have in this vehicle and the higher ground clearance that we have means that the rear end of the vehicle tends to lift off the ground just a little bit more than we see in the S90. It feels a little bit more like an SUV if you really start pushing it in the corners. A few people that I've talked to recently have complained about the overall handling feel in Volvo's 90 series products. Volvo has always marched to a slightly different drummer when it comes to overall suspension tuning. That's the best way to describe what's going on here. The S90 is a very capable vehicle, as is the V90 and the XC90. They all actually compete very well in their segments in terms of overall handling ability, but the feel is a little bit different than what we find in most of the German brands. Versus the Mercedes or the Audi, the steering is a little bit more isolated in the V90. In addition to that, the way that Volvo has chosen to tune their adaptive suspension system is different than what we see in the Mercedes E400. The V90, like the S90, has a partial air suspension if you select that option, and that's what we have in this particular vehicle. So the rear suspension is sitting on airbags that helps load level the vehicle, and then the front suspension uses more traditional adaptive dampers. The two systems work in coordination to help stiffen things up if you want a sportier experience, or soften things out if you want a more comfortable ride. Unlike the system that we find in the larger XC90, this does not height level overall, so we cannot raise the entire vehicle or lower the entire vehicle like we do find in that crossover. Volvo tells us that the air suspension up front that we find in the XC90 could not be adapted to fit under the low-slung hood that we find in this model. The V90 Cross Country is in theory targeted right at my demographic. I live about 1.5 miles down a gravel road like we're driving on right here, and I do commute daily on this to work. But I also commute daily on winding mountain roads, and to be perfectly honest, I never had a problem in my lowered V70R on this same road. Compared to Volvo's S90 sedan, this suspension is definitely more tuned for gravel road or rough road use. Although I wouldn't really call the V90 Cross Country an off-road vehicle, because even though we have 8.3 inches of ground clearance, the all-wheel drive system in this vehicle is not going to be as capable as something you'd find in a Jeep Grand Cherokee or Range Rover. And you should also keep in mind that this is notably longer than something like Volvo's XC60. That means that in general terms, this is going to be less capable off-road than Volvo's compact luxury crossover. When it comes to our overall ride score, I'm going to give this an A-. I find the Mercedes E400 to be a more comfortable ride overall, but I actually am okay with the way that the V90 and the S90 ride overall. In our cabin noise test, we scored 71 decibels at 50 miles an hour, which makes this a little bit louder than the S90 sedan, but overall fairly quiet for this segment. It's quite comparable to the Mercedes-Benz E400. Some folks out there have noted that this engine has a definite 4-cylinder sound to it that you don't find in the E400. I didn't find that particularly bothersome, but you do hear more engine noise coming from under the hood than you find in the Audi A4 or that Mercedes E400. When it comes to fuel economy, I'm going to give this an A, and if Volvo ever brings the T8 version of this vehicle to the US, that's likely going to get an A+. With a 25 mile per gallon EPA combined score for this 316 horsepower all-wheel drive model, it is notably more efficient than the E400 or the BMW 535i Grand Touring, which you could also consider a direct competitor to this. Both the Mercedes and the BMW get 21 miles per gallon average, which is notably below this. The Audi A4 is currently rated for 25 miles per gallon, but it uses a dual clutch transmission, and that dual clutch transmission is not going to be as smooth as the 8-speed automatic that we find under this hood. Dual clutch transmissions feature very fast shifts, and they have a very sporty feel to them, but they're not exactly smooth, especially in slow and go or stop and go traffic. If you live out in the country and you find yourself on roads like this often, then the V90 Cross Country is an excellent option for you. If you live in town and you don't find yourself needing to drive out on roads like this, then the V90 without the Cross Country package is going to be an excellent alternative to the Mercedes E400. Acceleration in the Volvo is quite similar to the Audi or the Mercedes Wagon, but fuel economy is notably above the Mercedes Wagon, and overall drivetrain smoothness is better than the Audi. Handling may fall a little bit behind the Audi and the Mercedes, but I think that overall the Volvo's other attributes definitely compensate. When you take a look at the V90 and the V90 Cross Country, it's important to remember that again, the V90 is available only as an ordered vehicle or via their overseas delivery program, whereas you can find the V90 Cross Country pre-configured on dealer lots. The V90 starts with Volvo's less powerful turbocharged only 4-cylinder engine in the R design trim, which is the Looks Sporty trim. And that's why its price tag at $49,950 is lower than the V90 Cross Country, which starts at $55,300. It looks like the Cross Country package will cost you $5,000, but that's not actually the case, because if you were to add the same features, especially the T6 engine and all-wheel drive, to the V90, then it would be just about the same price. The key differences between the V90 and the V90 Cross Country are the ability to get the sportier R design looks to the exterior, the less powerful 4-cylinder engine, and the 2-wheel drive model. As we've come to expect from Volvo, the list of standard equipment is very extensive as well. The 12.3-inch LCD instrument cluster is standard in all V90 models. That's something that you don't see in very many of the competition. Adaptive cruise control is also standard because it is the key component in Volvo's active safety system, which is standard in all V90 models. That system gives you Volvo's city safety system, which will attempt to completely stop the vehicle or reduce the speed depending on the situation if it thinks you're going to run into another car, a cyclist, a pedestrian, or even large animals. It also gives you the lane keeping assistance system and their semi-autonomous driving package. Very much like other semi-autonomous systems out there, the system tries to give 100% of the steering effort required for some driving situations, but not all driving situations. So this is not Tesla Autopilot, and it's not quite the same kind of semi-autonomous system that we see in the latest Audi models either, but it is more advanced than simply the lane-keeping assistance system that we find in certain Acura models. In addition, the steering LED headlamps, dimming mirrors, and LED headlamps are all standard in all V90 models. That's really important when you start comparing the V90 to the competition. When it comes to likes and dislikes, my top like for the V90 is the design, both inside and outside. The V90 is a very, very attractive vehicle to my eye. It's also very well priced, and the interior is very luxurious, especially if you opt for the top-end trims with the leather dashboard and leather doors. It's hard to find an interior that is better put together than the Volvo V90 or S90 series interiors under about $100,000. On the downside, the V90 is not as practical as we've come to expect from Volvo wagons, and that's a trend that we first saw with the Volvo V60 wagon, which was considerably smaller than the V70 wagon that it replaced. Of course, in theory, the V70 wagon was replaced by both the V60 and the V90 wagon, although neither of those wagons holds as much stuff in the back as the older V70 did, and it's all because of the very sexy side profile that we see in the V90. By lowering the roofline a little bit more as things go to the rear and giving us that sloped rear glass, it makes the design look sexier and more modern, but it also means that the rear is less practical. Acceleration is good from both the T5 and T6 engines, as is fuel economy, but you will find faster 0 to 60 performance in some of the competition. That brings us along to the competition. Let's talk about the Audi Allroad first. The Allroad is an A4-based wagon. We don't get the A6 wagon in the United States or an A6-based Allroad. That's very important to keep in mind, because the Audi Allroad starts at $42,700, which would appear to be a lot less expensive than the comparable Volvo. Except that the comparable Volvo is not a V90 cross-country, it's actually a V60 cross-country. That size difference accounts for many of the pros that we see in the Audi Allroad. The performance for the size of the vehicle, the handling ability, etc. is all excellent in the Audi Allroad, but we are talking about a car that is smaller. And that's really obvious when we hop on the inside. Audi does a good job of packaging in their A4-sized vehicle, but the V90 is going to feel more spacious. It's also going to feel more premium inside because it's the next category up. Just like the S90 competes with the Audi A6, the V90 competes with the A6 wagon, which doesn't exist in the US. That said, it is pretty easy to compare the Audi Allroad to the V90 in some respects, because if you get carried away with your options in the Audi, it could get just as expensive as the V90, but you get a bigger vehicle that's a little bit smoother out on the road than the Audi. The A4 Allroad has excellent fuel economy, but that's mainly because of its dual clutch transmission, and that's just not as smooth as the 8-speed that we see in the Volvo. Next up, we have BMW's 5 Series Gran Turismo, because we don't have a 5 Series wagon in the US either. Although this is as close as you can get to a 5 Series wagon in America, it's not quite the same thing, because the 5 Series GT is more of a liftback. It has that sort of Prius-like side profile. It's not a wagon, even though, again, Volvo's wagons don't have quite a traditional wagon profile either. The 5 Series GT has an enormous back seat. It has an awful lot of room back there in terms of legroom and headroom both. It also has very comfortable front seats, especially if you opt for BMW's excellent multi-contour front seats. And as you'd expect from BMW, it has excellent rear-wheel drive driving dynamics, even if you choose the all-wheel drive model. There's also a very powerful twin-turbo V8 if you want to go from 0 to 60 faster than every other entry in this group. On the downside, the 5 Series GT is going to cost you considerably more than the Volvo. We're talking at least $10,000 more. The starting price of the 5 Series GT is just $5,000 more than the V90 Cross Country, but you'll find more than $5,000 worth of standard equipment in the Volvo that you won't find in the 5 GT. In addition to that, the 5 Series Gran Turismo is not quite the same vehicle as the V90 or the V90 Cross Country, because even though it's trying to be sort of a crossover alternative, it doesn't have the same kind of crossover ride height or ground clearance that we find in the Cross Country. The other main wagon competitor for the V90 is the Mercedes-Benz E-Class wagon. It only comes in E400 flavor at the moment. It's kind of an interesting twist for Mercedes that they're bringing only the twin-turbo V6 engine to the US, but it is understandable because not that many people seem to be buying large, expensive European luxury wagons. And therefore, Mercedes decided not to bring too many variants of that wagon to this country. That means that if you want something more efficient or without all-wheel drive, Mercedes is not going to be an option. On the flip side, Mercedes' twin-turbo V6 is an absolutely excellent engine, and it's paired to their new 9-speed automatic transmission. The E-Class wagon also benefits from all the latest gadgets and gizmos that we see in the E-Class sedan. It has quite simply the nicest interior in this segment, the ability to customize that interior in ways that we don't see in the Volvo or the BMW or the Audi. And of course, I find the E-Class's exterior and interior very, very attractive. You just have to be very careful with the options, because not only is the E-Class wagon considerably more expensive than the Volvo V90 wagon, if you get carried away with options, it's pretty easy to get it up to almost $90,000. And for $90,000, you could buy a very nicely configured Volvo V90 Cross Country and a smaller vehicle for weekends. Although the E400 comes standard with all-wheel drive, it is still not an off-road style wagon like we find in the V90 Cross Country. In this telephone box size segment, my top pick is the Mercedes E400, but you'd better have deep pockets. It is the best wagon by far that I have driven in this category, but it is very, very expensive. My runner-up and the more practical pick, of course, would be the V90 and the V90 Cross Country. The interior and the exterior design compare very, very well to the Mercedes-Benz E400, but it is going to be significantly less expensive. Because of Volvo's drivetrain design, it's not going to be quite as luxurious sounding, not quite as smooth, and of course a little bit more front-heavy than the E400, but it's going to be thousands and thousands of dollars less expensive. Be sure and let me know what you think about the V90 and the V90 Cross Country down there in the comments section below. Be sure and find us over at facebook.com/AlexandAutos, and if you want to support this channel, head over to patreon.com and look us up over there. I'll see you next week.